Mr. President, Herr Rektor, Herr Verwaltungsratspräsident, Frau Staatsschreiberin, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Zurich. Welcome to the Europa Institute. It is our great honor this evening to welcome the President of the Republic of Latvia, Mr. Egils Levits. We live, ladies and gentlemen, in extraordinary times. There is also talk of a turning point in time. There is a war going on in Europe. Your neighbor Russia, Mr. President, has invaded Ukraine and is waging a brutal war of conquest and destruction. Only a few weeks ago, we would not have thought this possible. All over Europe, we are stunned. Your country, Mr. President, is in the immediate vicinity of the aggressor. Today, therefore, we understand better why membership in the European Union, and above all in NATO, is of existential importance to you. A small country needs the community of democratic states that are willing to defend common values. Winston Churchill, whose 1946 speech is commemorated here in this assembly hall, put it this way: the salvation of the common people of every race and every land from war or servitude must be established based on solid foundations and must be guarded by the readiness of all men and women to die rather than to submit to tyranny. Admittedly, it sounds martial. Only a few weeks ago, many would have lacked the insight to say so. Today, unfortunately, the truth is clearly before our eyes. What can give us courage and confidence in these dark times? Churchill asked, "What is this sovereign remedy?" His answer, "It is to recreate the European family, or as much of it as we can, and to provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, in safety, and in freedom." This structure is called now European Union. God knows it is not perfect, but it has stood the test of time in the recent crisis. The Union has not allowed itself to be divided. It is ready to show solidarity and support to Ukraine. Whether what has been decided so far is enough remains to be seen. Probably more is needed. But it seems that the Union is determined to do what is necessary. I hope that my country will also be ready to do so. Freedom has a price. Ladies and gentlemen, a few words about the biography of our speaker. Mr. Levits was born in Riga in 1955. In 1972, he graduated from Riga Secondary School, and then he immigrated with his family to Germany, where he graduated from the Münster Latvian Grammar School in 1973. In 1982, Mr. Levits graduated from the Faculty of Law of the University of Hamburg. In 1986, he graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy and Public Science at the University also of Hamburg. Mr. Levits has actively participated in the restoration of Latvia in 1989 to 1991. He was a member of the Council of the Latvian People's Front and the Congress of Citizens. He is an author of the concept of the Declaration on the Restoration of Independence of Latvia of 4 May 1990. Mr. Levits was the first Minister of Justice after full restoration of the Constitution, the first ambassador of Latvia to Germany and to Switzerland also, after the restoration. The first Latvian judge at European Court of Human Rights from 1995 to 2004, and the first Latvian judge at European Court of Justice, 2004 to 2019. It's this European Court of Justice with Switzerland feared so much. Mr. Levits was elected President of the Republic of Latvia on 29 May 2019, and he took office on 8 July 2019. It's a great honor for us, Mr. President, that you are here, and I say, you have the floor.
Es freut mich sehr, wieder in der Schweiz zu sein, in Zürich zu sein und hier an der Universität Zürich. Ich habe vor diesem Vortrag lange trainiert, ein so grimmiges Gesicht aufzusetzen, aber es gelingt mir nicht. So, ich werde mit einem normalen Gesicht diesen Vortrag dann machen. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Europe and the world are in a time of historic turmoil. I would compare it to a volcanic eruption. When a volcano erupts, a stream of hot lava covers the entire volcanic area. Hot lava transforms everything. Nothing is left of the current landscape. But soon after, the lava hardens and forms a new topography, a new landscape that remains unchanged for a long time, until the next eruption. It's the same with the history. In the great moments of history, which can be compared to volcanic eruptions, old countries perish, new states are born, new political systems emerge, a new international order forms. There have been 3 such volcanic eruptions of history in the 20th century. The first eruption occurred after the First World War, when 2 European empires collapsed and 9 new states emerged in Europe. The second, in 1945, when a new map of Europe was created and the Iron Curtain divided the world. This curtain divided Europe in half. One part, including Switzerland, was on the side that could live according to the principles of democracy. The other part, including my country Latvia, became hostage to a totalitarian ideology. Finally, in 1990, when the political map of Europe was redrawn for the 3rd time, this order, which existed until Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 22, was characterized by self-determination, democracy, and freedom. However, at the same time, we also observed a certain naivety and carelessness, arrogant self-confidence and illusions about the universality and sustainability of the idea of human rights and freedom. And now, in 2022, we are currently witnessing the first eruption of the century's volcano of history. We are witnessing the birth of a new era, a Zeitenwende. While the hot lava of the volcano is still soft, it can be formed. In times of geopolitical turmoil, political ideas and the stance of politicians, countries, and civil society have a significant impact. They create the reality of life for the ensuing peaceful times. For Western democracies, this time of eruption is also a time of opportunity, a time for reassessing values, discarding illusions, and thinking creatively. I can assure you, this period will be brief. Afterwards, for many decades to come, we will live in the world we shaped in this month and in this year. Our task is to ensure that this short window of time, when everything is still in flux, does not become what political scientists and historians will one day call the beginning of the rapid decline of democracy. This series of traditional lectures was begun by Winston Churchill, a politician who influenced and shaped the future of Europe for a long time. Here at the University of Zurich, on 19 September 1946, he said the famous words, "Let Europe arise." It took an impressive geopolitical imagination to foresee the new landscape of European and global international order. It was only 1 year after the end of a devastating war between European nations at a time of fear and hatred. Churchill not only hoped that Europe would be reborn, but also offered a vision of how this could happen. He spoke of a new community of European democracies, overcoming domestic self-interest and forging closer transnational ties. It would protect the free European countries from the aggressive expansion of the Soviet Union. In his vision of a free Europe, he also included Germany, whose Nazi regime had led to the devastation of the World War II, but was now taking, 1946, its first steps towards democracy under the supervision of the Western allies. However, at the same time, Churchill accepted, or rather was forced to accept, that the European nations behind the Iron Curtain, including Latvia, would remain under the rule of the totalitarian Soviet Russian Empire. For us Latvians and other nations, this meant another 45 years in devastating captivity. Churchill's 1946 speeches at Fulton in March and here in Zurich in September marked a new geopolitical formation, the West. The West, that means the countries of Europe and North America, united by a liberal democratic political system based on certain values with a fundamentally universal character. The West has existed already as a historical and cultural concept since the Middle Ages. It seems that it was first used by Martin Luther when he referred to Abendland as opposed to Morgenland. However, it only appears as a specific category of geopolitics immediately after the Second World War. The ideological opposition between the West and the Communist bloc during the Cold War left the world balancing on the brink of nuclear war until 1990. At the same time, the threat from the expansive Soviet Russia, which has seized Central and Eastern Europe and potentially wanted to impose its socialist state system on the rest of the world, made Western democracies more deeply identify with their common cultural and intellectual roots and the value of their democratic political systems. The international order of the Cold War ended between 1989 and 1991, when the third volcanic eruption of 20th century history took place. The Soviet-Russian Empire collapsed. The European captive nations regained their freedom. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia restored their independence they had lost in 1940 as a result of the illegal Hitler-Stalin Pact. Democracy as a form of government was established in virtually all of Europe for a short period of time, even in Russia and in many other countries around the world, in particular in Latin America. The bipolar world changed into a multipolar world. Globalization ruled both in economy and the information space. I would like to emphasize that the independence movements of Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians played a major role in the downfall of the Soviet-Russian Empire and thus in the turning point of history. The inspiration and driving force in this third major historical eruption of the 20th century was freedom. The idea of freedom has universal appeal. It is based on the individual's natural desire for autonomy, the right to decide for oneself. Freedom is the opposite of a determinist worldview. The idea of freedom is not static. It is in dynamic interaction with social customs, norms, and laws. Moments of historical breakthrough most clearly shed light on people's perceptions of the freedom of will and freedom of action. These moments illuminate people's willingness to accept or to reject a particular regulatory framework in which to exercise their freedom. The idea of freedom is a central axis of the modern West. It is an individual's desire for freedom that has created the basis of the Western democracies to provide the best political framework for the practice of freedom. The political and legal history of the Western world is a long series of efforts to find the best balance between protecting the freedoms of each individual and meaningfully harmonizing the freedoms of different individuals. A democratic state governed by rule of law is a form of government that best allows everyone's freedom to be exercised. Russia has a different historical experience. Since the time of Ivan the Terrible, the Kremlin has always claimed to represent an alternative to European history. In their opposition to the Western world, Russian rulers have always argued that Western values, personal freedom, human dignity, and democracy are not universal and are not suitable for Russia. Putin continues this historical narrative. The aim of Russian invasion of Ukraine is to restore its autocratic empire, the disintegration of which began after the First World War. As former US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski famously said, "Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire." Russia began to rebuild the empire in 2008 after a military invasion of Georgia. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 in the war in Donbass, along with the invasion of Ukraine that began on the 24th of February this year, is a continuation of this narrative. Putin wants to make history as the man who restored the Russian Empire, which could also play the role of a hegemonial power over the whole Europe. However, this was never has been the vision of the nations brutally conquered by Russian Empire: the Finns, the Poles, the Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Ukrainians, and others. To illustrate this, I would like to mention the Honorable Latvian statesman Egils Levits, whose life is closely connected with Switzerland. In 1907, he obtained his doctoral degree in state sciences, Staatswissenschaften, here at your university, the University of Zurich. Egils Levits describes the Russian Empire as a prison of individuals and nations. In order to ensure the freedom of the individuals, he saw only one solution: the destruction of the Russian Empire and the creation of democratic nation-states belonging to the Western world. In 1903, in the Latvian revolutionary newspaper Proletarian, published here in Switzerland, he wrote a conceptual article on the transformation of Russia. It formulated for the first time the Latvian nation's demand for its own state. He concluded his article with the call, "Down with Russia." The geopolitical landscape that emerged after the First World War allowed Latvians to bring Walter's vision into reality. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the disappearance of the ideological adversary of the Cold War, the new zeitgeist was embodied by Francis Fukuyama's theory of the end of history. Fukuyama was convinced that the bankruptcy of the Soviet bloc means the ultimate victory of liberal democracy and free market. There was the belief that the export of liberal democracy was both possible and inevitable, a position that has been maintained for many years by Western political elites and international organizations. Until the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the prevailing ideology was that Russia would be transformed through engagement. The West believed that Russia's Wandel durch Handel was possible. I would like to emphasize that Fukuyama's theory proved irrelevant because it was based on a faulty premise. Instead of individual freedom and the rule of law, the values of a consumer society were wrongly seen as a driving force which would transform an authoritarian system into a liberal democracy. Yes, freedom and justice make it possible for people to live in prosperity, but prosperity and the free market do not always create freedom and justice. We see many examples in the world. We often see the privileges of democracy as a self-evident, enduring benefit. They seem as natural as the air we breathe. However, we don't think about the air on a daily basis, and we only become aware when it has already been polluted. Democracy is not guaranteed once and for all. I would like to recall the words of Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, when he said, "Democracy is always under threat." Democracy must be nurtured and safeguarded. Israel's Chief Justice Aaron Barak has said that if democracy could collapse in the Germany of Kant and Beethoven, no one is safe. Yet, democracy is not helpless. Modern constitutional democracies also includes the concept of self-defending democracy. In German, wehrhafte Demokratie. Self-defending democracy means that the freedoms guaranteed by democracy cannot be used to undermine democracy itself. Public institutions and citizens have a duty to defend and safeguard democracy against the threats. That is the essence of the concept of self-defending democracy. Prior to World War II, the democratic constitution of the Weimar Republic did not have such a defense mechanism. It was believed that in a democracy, the majority has unlimited rights. And indeed, Joseph Goebbels, as Reichsminister of Propaganda, reminded the world that, I quote, "It will always remain the best joke of democracy, that it gave its mortal enemies the means by which it was destroyed." But we have learned from the Weimar experiences. Modern democracy is not and must not be toothless. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European countries are closing their information space to the Kremlin propaganda TV channels. This is not a restriction of the freedom of expression, because these channels are not media, but rather weapons being used in an information war against both Ukraine and the West. Likewise, I welcome the European Parliament's call for a ban on European political parties from receiving funding from third countries in order to prevent them from undermining democracy. The democratic state is not a self-evident product of historical development. It has been in operation for a historical short time and in a relatively small part of the world. Democracy is far from being perfect. However, a democratic state governed by rule of law is the only form of state that is aware of its own mistakes and own shortcomings. By ensuring the free flow of thoughts and ideas, it is able to learn from its failures, adjust its course, and improve itself. Sometimes it's slow, but in the long run, it is a system which allows to find better solutions. In autocratic and totalitarian regimes, decisions can be made more quickly. But this efficiency is at the expense of individual freedoms. However, the imagined stability of authoritarian regimes is often an illusion. A totalitarian regime is like a glass wall that encapsulates the person's desire for freedom. When touched, the glass appears to be solid, but by striking the glass in the right place, it breaks into pieces. The history of Russia is an example of this. At the same time, Russia's challenge to the international order represents a challenge to the Western moral universe and centered on the notion of freedom. Anna Applebaum recently wrote, "There is no natural liberal world order, and there are no rules without someone to enforce them. No rules without someone to enforce them. Unless democracies defend themselves together, the forces of autocracy will destroy them." So far, Anne Applebaum. Every action and inaction will affect the outcome of Russia's war against Ukraine. The outcome of the war will in turn affect the global geopolitical landscape for the next decades. Russia does not respect countries that are militarily and politically weak and lack the will and ability to defend themselves and their allies. Therefore, it is not the strength of the West and NATO that provokes Russia, but rather its weakness. That is why appeasement of Russia is counterproductive. In recent months, it was once again demonstrated by the failed efforts of some Western politicians to persuade Putin to abide by international law. Russia respects only determined will and strength. It does not respect those who try to please and flatter. It is a weakness of the West that provokes Russia to go further. Today, the world can follow Russia's war against Ukraine online. This has resulted in a global moral outrage. It has created an immense values-based solidarity and demand for action from politicians. The task of politicians is not to describe what kind of crime Russia is committing in Ukraine. This is a task of analysts and commentators, of journalists. The task of politicians is not to condemn Russia for the 100th time. It's enough with 10 times. The task of politicians is to act, to help Ukraine to stop Russia. Our solidarity will help Ukraine to recover. At the same time, it will also help the West to recover as a community of values. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 4 interlinked tasks that need to be carried out immediately: to support Ukraine, to isolate Russia, to punish those who have committed crimes against humanity, and to strengthen democratic institutions and organizations. First, Ukraine must be helped with military equipment, humanitarian aid, and the protection of refugees. As described by Timothy Snyder, Ukraine must not remain a bloodland. No country in Europe wants and deserves to be a bloodland. Ukrainians are fighting so heroically because they know what it means to live under Russian rule. One day, this war will end. And I strongly believe with the victory of Ukraine. Ukraine will then need to rebuild its cities destroyed by Russian bombers and the fields ravaged by Russian tanks. Ukraine will deserve its very own Marshall Plan and its rightful place in Europe. This will not bring the thousands of innocent killed Ukrainians back to life, but it will be remembered for years to come that their fight was not in vain. Second, as long as this aggressive autocratic regime is in power in Russia, Russia must be isolated, economically and politically. Europe needs to break its dependence on the main lever of Russian political influence, oil and gas. Every euro we spend on Russian gas and oil finances the tanks and bombs that attack on Ukrainian civilians. Ukrainians are paying for their freedom with blood. We must prepare to pay with increased costs and sacrifices in our comfort. Third, one of the cornerstones of democracy is the rule of law on national level and also on international level. Therefore, those responsible for the war crimes committed in Ukraine must be brought to justice sooner or later. Not only Putin, but also the whole chain of command, down to physical perpetrators of the crimes. Ukraine has already started to identify them. No one can excuse himself with reference to an order of a superior. The International Criminal Court in Hague has already launched an investigation. In parallel, Ukraine filed a lawsuit against Russia at the International Court of Justice in Hague. On my initiative, Latvia has joined Ukraine's claim in the International Court of Justice and supports the investigation of Russian war crimes in the International Criminal Court. At present, Ukrainian refugees can testify at the Latvian prosecutor's office. Their evidence will be used in international courts. Within the United Nations and alongside with Switzerland, We have also recently joined the group of friends of accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. An independent international commission of inquiry has been set up by the United Nations Human Rights Council to investigate Russian war crimes, and they will report by September. The possibility of setting up a special international tribunal for Russia's crimes in Ukraine is also being discussed, like special tribunal for Yugoslavia or special tribunal for Cambodia, and there are other examples. And I strongly support this idea. It is important to show that aggressions have serious consequences, that aggression do not create rights. The investigation and detection of crimes by international courts could prevent similar aggressions in the future. Aggression against another country must never be normalized, no matter how long it takes. For too long, we have been weak in our efforts to assess the crimes committed by Russia and the previous Soviet regime against its peaceful neighboring countries and against their own population. However, now all roads must lead to Hague. Fourth, we need to strengthen the institutions of democracy at home and the ability of the Western countries to defend themselves. We need to strengthen the international organizations that ensure all countries the opportunity to participate in decision-making and global engagement. I also welcome the Summit for Democracy, initiated by US President Joe Biden, which took place for the first time at the end of the last year. It promotes closer cooperation between the world's democracies, of which there are around 100 of different quality, in order to defend their values and to play a more visible role in the international order. Nevertheless, as we have seen in today's world, goodwill, international law, and soft power are not enough to safeguard our values and our democracies. They must be backed by military force when needed. NATO is the strongest military alliance in the history and has maintained the peace in the North Atlantic region for over 3/4 of a century. The end of NATO, through a loss of purpose or fracturing of interests, had been predicted many times. Last time, I think for 2 years, from the French president. Yet we see today that NATO is more united and stronger than it has ever been. Russia's misguided and violent venture in Ukraine may not be the last or even the most dangerous threat to the rules-based international order. We must do all that we can to strengthen the solidarity of democracies across the world, to promote the cohesion of European Union, and to increase the defense capacity of NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, we feel change simmering in the air, but we do not yet know how it will look like. Winston Churchill once stood and spoke here in a similar atmosphere of change. What would we tell to him today? That the Iron Curtain fell only to return again in a slightly different location 30 years later? Will we passively stand aside and watch the lava harden, creating a new European landscape where Ukraine no longer exists and Europe is dominated by autocratic Russia? The post-Cold War era in Europe is now over. Democracy's naivety and illusions have vanished. However, Western liberal democracies must not surrender. We must not allow Putin's Russia to shape our future, to shape the future of Europe. Our strength is based on our freedom, our rule of law, and our solidarity, solidarity of democracies. Our strength is based on the appeal of our way of life in a democracy and our willingness to defend it. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. Very powerful, very clear language, very rich indeed. Thank you so much. You mentioned 4 action points, in a way, towards the end of your presentation, what you were expecting yourself and others to do in these difficult circumstances Europe right now is in. We now have the chance to ask questions to the President. As you have seen, the President understands perfectly German and speaks also perfectly German, so you can also ask the question in German, but the answer probably will be in English for a more international audience. Maybe let me start with a very stupid, maybe simple question, Mr. President. Why can't the Russian treat their neighbors nicely? It looks like all neighbors, in a way, are always dominated or lectured, and if you don't do this, we come and teach you a lesson. Why can't they be nice to their neighbors?
I think it's a right question. And my answer is that Russia is thinking on the categories of the 19th century, imperialistic century. It was normal in the 19th century to conquer neighbors, to conquer in overseas territories. It was a normal expansion of an empire. But we are now in the 21st century, and then there is a clash between the thinking of the 19th century and the thinking of the 21st century. We would like, so for example, Germany, after 1945, learned very quickly after the defeat in the Second World War, of course, but anyway, it has also the dreams about the domination in the world, or at least in Europe, between 1933 and 1945. And of course, it was a danger for all neighbors. And they wanted to conquer Europe at least, and Russia at least. At the end. So, and after the Second World War, these dreams disappeared completely. And if there would not be this change of thinking in Germany after 1945, maybe in the next 3, 5, 4 years, then there would not be now Europe. That would be not European Union. It would not be possible. So with a Nazi thinking, to have a common community with France. Yeah? So, and they changed completely the worldview after the defeat, of course. But this is a reason why Europe could emerge, as Churchill said. Churchill has, by the way, it was only 1 year after the defeat of Germany, he has a trust in German society that they will change this perception of the world, and he was right. But for Russia, it is necessary to do it now. It's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, was Russland nie gemacht hat.
So is it a bit that rules are for the small ones, right? And the big and powerfuls don't have to obey them?
Rules-based international order is for all, and therefore it is very important. Sometimes I am asked, so it's not possible to bring Putin to Hague, and so. Anyway, it is necessary to maintain the international law. International law is the basis of peace, as as it's stated in the UN statutes on 45. And even if in reality sometimes there are breaches, we should maintain them. We cannot go back, and then because that would be a very aggressive, a very unfriendly world if we would not stick to the international law. And therefore, I mentioned these international tribunals, which are necessary, which are needed in order to maintain the law and to show the whole world that there is not a normality, such behavior, but a violation of the law.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from the audience? Please, there is a hand going up here, right? The microphone is coming.
Dear Mr. President, what do you think? What can your country, Latvia, learn from Swiss and the Swiss political system?
Okay. May I answer?
Have 5 minutes, right?
May I answer auf German? Ja? Okay. Ich habe bereits unseren Staatsmann Egils Levits erwähnt. Er hat hier studiert, wahrscheinlich in diesem Saal ist er gewesen. Er war einer der Verfassungsväter Lettlands, der lettischen Verfassung, und er war sehr beeindruckt von der direkten Demokratie oder von der Demokratie in der Schweiz. Weil Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts Demokratie war nicht selbstverständlich in Europa. Es gab nur ein paar demokratische Staaten, wahrscheinlich Schweden und Dänemark und natürlich United Kingdom und natürlich die Schweiz. Und deshalb war die lettische Nationalbewegung immer demokratisch orientiert. Wir hatten kein anderes Modell. Und deshalb hat diese Modellwirkung der Schweiz einen sehr tiefen Einfluss in unsere Verfassung, so dass wir leben in unserer Verfassung, wo wir inkludiert haben die schweizerische Verfassung. So, das ist das, was wir gelernt haben, und wir leben jeden Tag, also diese Elemente der schweizerischen Verfassung in unserer Verfassung. So, das ist ein sehr wichtiger Beitrag. Natürlich auch, dass die Schweiz auf der internationalen Parkett eine wichtige Rolle spielt und versucht, friedensstiftend zu sein. Das ist natürlich auch für uns und für andere kleine Staaten sehr, sehr wichtig.
Ihre Regierung nimmt ja sehr wichtige, remarkable decisions im Moment und Entscheidungen wahr. Gibt es auch etwas, was die Schweiz von Ihrem Land lernen kann?
Ich habe die lettische Verfassung erwähnt, wo viele Elemente der schweizerischen Verfassung enthalten sind. Aber wir haben 2014 unsere Verfassung vervollständigt, und die Schweizer Verfassung ist von 2000, die jetzige, die neue. Und wir haben dort die Werte und die Prinzipien, auf der der moderne demokratische Staat gegründet ist, dort relativ ausführlich beschrieben. Ich würde sagen, das ist wichtig, auch dass der Bürger seine Verfassung liest und dort auch, sagen wir, Anleitung zum täglichen Handeln erfährt. Und ich glaube, das ist die modernste Präambel in der Verfassung, die in der Welt noch ist. Ich glaube, das wäre vielleicht ein interessanter Beitrag. Aber sonst, ich glaube, wir sind, sowohl die Schweiz als auch Lettland, wir versuchen, also die Mentalitäten, die Bürgermentalitäten sind sehr ähnlich. Also wir sind anti-autoritär. Und manchmal, ich bin ja Vertreter der Autorität des Staates, ist es manchmal schwierig. Und ich glaube, Und ich glaube, genau diese anti-autoritäre, die Bürgerhaltung ist gemeinsam zwischen der Schweiz und Lettland. Für die Regierenden ist es nicht leicht. Ich habe heute Morgen mit dem Schweizer Bundespräsidenten auch darüber gesprochen. Aber es ist sehr, sehr wichtig, dass es so ist und so bleibt.
Ich hatte etwas in die Richtung außenpolitische Entscheidungen gefragt, aber wir lassen das. Da ist eine Hand, vielleicht hier in der Mitte, der Herr, und dann nachher die Dame hier. Gell? Hier in der Mitte, ja.
Thank you, Mr. President. This war has not only destroyed homes and families of good friends of mine, but as well scattered my family a little since I have relatives in Russia. And my question is, do you see, is there any hope for Russia at some point during our lifetime to become a free, democratic, liberal country? Thank you.
Ja, das ist die Frage der Fragen. This is a question of all questions. Of course, I said previously that the basis for a peaceful Europe was that Germany, after the Second World War, completely changed their attitudes to their neighbors and to change their worldview. And only then can also Russia be a, I would say, normal state, normal, peaceful state. And of course, we have no problem with Germany. And why we have no problem with Germany, despite that still 1945, we have also very, very important problems, because they changed their attitude. I cannot predict when this happens in Russia. There is a small elite which are Western-oriented and they are criticizing Putin's regime. But we know also from the polls that the great majority of Russian population supports this politics. And this is very dangerous. So I cannot answer. I would like to answer your question, but till this point is reached, the change of the attitude of Russia, not only the regime, but also of the population, of the main part of the majority of the population. Till this point is reached, a point in history, we should be realistic and base our security architecture on the reality that we have to deal with an aggressive imperialistic Russia. And that means we should be strong in all areas, politically and militarily, and also economically, in order to keep Russia so where Russia is now. So to say, this is the answer.
So it looks like not in my lifetime, probably, right? Not. Please, I've seen the hand of this lady here on the right hand. Please.
Thank you. Dear Mr. President, I hope that you deem this question interesting enough that you answer it. If Mr. Putin were here right now, what would you tell him?
I would say to him, they should give an order to return the military in the borders of Russia. It's so simply, nothing else. Maybe a second advice. This is my demand. The second advice: you should allow democracy for your own people.
There is a hand up there, far in the back. Yeah.
I have a question. In the most recent developments, we have seen worldwide developments that led to people trading in their sense of freedom for safety and for prosperity. For example, we have seen many African and Middle Eastern nations drawn to Russia in the sense to reach their goal to achieve prosperity and safety for their own people. How can Europe, in their how can Europe ensure that the people of the world don't see themselves drawn to Russia and other totalitarian systems, and that they receive a fair price, a fair deal of freedom?
You mean that the people in different parts of the world are attracted by Russia?
Yes.
Or
That they trade. What I mean is that, for example, in China, we have seen that they trade in their freedom of press and their freedom of where they live in terms of surveillance, amongst others, that they trade in their freedom for safety. And how can we as Europe ensure that all the people of the world don't have to trade in their sense of freedom for safety?
I don't think so that there is alternative freedom or safety. The real democracy is also safe. I don't see the alternatives. If you want to live in safety, you should give up democracy. For example, in China, there is another model of society. It's not democratic, and they are using the modern technologies in order to control the society. This is another issue, and it's very important also for democracies, how we should prevent that the modern technologies are not used in order to control the people and to manipulate the people. This is a specific issue which also in our democracies we should be careful and think about. I think in democracies, the question of autonomy of people and not being manipulated would be the main debate in this decade, apart from Russia and the aggressive environment. Therefore, I think a real democracy is safe. Also, I don't see the alternative or safety or democracy.
It seems that Europe has changed its behavior somehow, right? People have to change their, maybe somehow a bit their luxury life in order to fight for what they believe in. Do you think Europeans, Western Europeans, are ready to do that now?
I don't. I think there is no real alternative. We should face the world as it is, and now we have to deal with aggressive Russia. And I say that Russia is also, the intention is not only to restore the previous empire, but also to be the hegemonial power in Europe. So, and I don't think that Swiss or another country would like this idea. So there is only alternative to surrender or to be strong in order to keep Russia politically, economically, also in the borders, within the borders. Yeah. It is not our choice. It is, so to say, the reality. The reality was also 39. There was also the politics of appeasement. Chamberlain is a main name. It does not help. And I say that there are different chancellors which are going to Moscow to tell him, dear Putin, please go back. So I don't think that it would be successful. I would hope that it would be successful politics, but realistically it is not. Realistically is only to have this strong will to defend our democracy, our way of life.
Some former chancellors are even member of boards, right? Please, here is a hand, or actually two hands. First, the gentleman with the red tie, and then the gentleman in front.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have two questions.
Short ones.
Well, I'll try. Thank you. At your last meeting with the Speaker of the Azerbaijani Parliament, Gafarova, 2 months ago, you underlined the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations. I kindly ask you to interpret your statement regarding Azerbaijan. Do you think that Nagorno-Karabakh has no right to self-determination like Kosovo? This was my first question. Then, a month ago, the Council of Europe passed a resolution on Nagorno-Karabakh condemning in the strongest possible terms the Armenophobia in Azerbaijan and the destruction of Armenian cultural assets in conquered territories. Accordingly, the Council of Europe emphasized that the disbursement of 2 billion euro European Union's aid package to Azerbaijan should be made strictly conditional on Azerbaijan's respect for its international commitments on human rights,
please. You have to
including regarding, I'm finishing, okay, the preservation and protection of the culture and historical heritage on the territories under its control. So my second question to you, Mr. President, do you agree with this resolution and its requirements? Thank you.
If I correctly understood that this resolution of the European Parliament is saying that Azerbaijan should respect the cultural heritage of Karabakh, of
Yes.
Armenians in Karabakh. Yes, of course. I think it is right because the cultural heritage of the people should be respected. Concerning the conflict of Karabakh, it is very, very tricky to decide who in which side is right. I'm not so deep in this conflict, but I would say that there should be found a compromise, and we are for that. But concerning the cultural heritage and of course the respect for the culture and the language of the people, there is no other solution as to respect. This is international law.
Okay, thank you very much. We have here this other hand, and then I saw a hand going up there to the left. But first, the gentleman here in the middle.
Mr. President, we talked a lot about Russia today, but there is an interesting neighbor to Russia, which is China, from which Europe is also very dependent. In your opinion, what should Europe do with regards to China, or what is the price of freedom in looking forward in this relationship?
Yeah. China is competing with US and Europe in technology and economy. And China has a different society, different values. And I would say that we have to be aware of that there is not only technological rise, but also the political race on the influence in the world. And in Europe, in the European Union, and including also other countries of Europe where are outside, like this, we have only 6-7% of the world population are living in Europe. It's a relatively small part, and we should look that we should play our role at least in order to safeguard our democracy, our way of life. And for this, I would stress again this technological issue. And we have now in 22 the situation that US is only maybe 1-2 years before China, but China is developing very fast, especially quantum computer and in artificial intelligence. And if there would be a change of who is the first, because then we will lose also the possibility to be autonomous in technological issues, and also that means also in political and economic issues. Also, the situation is now more or less aware for European politicians. It's a call for European strategic autonomy and so on and so on. But it is a very big issue for this decade, because if China would have the similar social order as we, democratic order, then I don't see the problem, just like US, for example. But if there is a different political order, then I see a certain danger, yeah.
In its fight against Russia, Europe depends heavily on the United States. How reliable are the United States really for Europe? I mean, we had the president just 2 years ago.
Yeah. Yes. I would say this administration is absolutely reliable. I met President Biden, and he ensured all times for Europeans and for Latvians and that America and Europe stand together. And I assume that is not only depends from the administration, but unless this is a general feeling of Americans. There are, of course, some rhetorics from some politicians or the previous politicians, but we should look what is reality, and I would say America is reliable.
Okay, very good. Then there's a question came from that left-hand side there. This lady, please.
Mr. President, let me come back to the title of your speech, The Price of Freedom. Sie sind bestens vertraut mit der hanseatischen, also auch der deutschen Seele. Wird Deutschland und damit wahrscheinlich ganz Europa die Erdöl- und Gasimporte aus Russland stoppen? Und wenn ja, wann beziehungsweise unter welchen Bedingungen? Dankeschön.
Das sind zwei Problemkreise. Ein Problemkreis ist natürlich, dass Deutschland nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg eine pazifistische oder eine quasi pazifistische Haltung eingenommen hat, und zwar zu Recht, weil das war ein Teil der Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Und erst in den 90er Jahren unter Außenminister Joschka Fischer hat Deutschland begonnen, auch außenpolitisch ein gewisses Gewicht zu zeigen. Auch zum Beispiel Beteiligung an den Friedensmissionen war bis in den 90er Jahren tabu für Deutschland. Und das ist sehr schwierig, das kann ich verstehen. Und ich muss sagen, dass die relativ plötzliche Änderung der deutschen Haltung bezüglich, sagen wir, Waffenlieferungen auch an die Ukraine, das war schon, das ist bemerkenswert. Natürlich gibt es Diskussionen über den Umfang und so weiter, aber ich sehe, dass die Deutschen machen das sich nicht leicht, aber sie kommen in die Realität an, oder ich würde sagen, sie sind in die Realität angekommen. Deshalb, ich sehe, dass eine solche, in einigen Wochen, eine solche jahrzehntelange Haltung zu ändern, ist nicht einfach. Und Deutschland hat das gemacht. Das Wort Zeitenwende stammt vom Bundeskanzler Scholz, und mehr oder weniger ist das auch geschehen. Die zweite Sache ist Öl- und Gaslieferungen. Da sind Probleme, weil man natürlich ist schwierig auf beides verzichten kann, auf Atomkraft und auf Gas und Öl. Was bleibt, ist relativ wenig, und man braucht sehr viele und Investitionen, um den Rest zu füllen. Aber Deutschland hat auch beschlossen, so schnell wie möglich aus dem russischen Gas auszusteigen. Zum Beispiel auch die Änderung der Haltung zu Nord Stream 2. Das ist für Deutschland eine große Sache. Wir in Lettland waren immer dagegen, gegen diesen Fehler, sich in eine strategische Abhängigkeit von Russland zu begeben. Aber nun gut, das ist ein Fehler, ist auch zugegeben worden von deutschen Politikern und die versuchen jetzt, das so schnell wie möglich davon loszukommen. Ich begrüße das, würde wünschen, dass es möglichst schnell passiert und daran arbeitet auch die Bundesregierung, dass es möglichst schnell passiert. Also ich sage, dass nicht nur Deutschland, also viele europäische Staaten haben übersehen, dass strategische Abhängigkeit von einem autokratischen, aggressiven Staat bekommt man nicht gut. Und jetzt ist der Ernstfall eingetreten, man hat die Realität erkannt und man handelt so schnell wie möglich.
Herr Präsident, ganz herzlichen Dank für die Diskussion. Ich darf nun das Wort übergeben an Herrn Lomeo Lache, den Verwaltungsratspräsidenten der Bank Julius Baer. Danke vielmals.
Danke.
Dear Mr. President, Your Excellencies, dear guests and distinguished friends, thank you very much again for your excellent speech, and I think your visit to Switzerland comes at a point in time where all the world's eyes are focused on Ukraine and the neighbor Russia. A point in time where values such as freedom, peace and independence are at the top of our minds. Your speech was not only very inspiring, but also very timely, and I thank you very much for the insightful view and your clear standpoint which you have presented to us. In 1946, Churchill has set out the vision of how Europe could rebuild itself as a peaceful, safe and prosperous continent here exactly at the same university here in Zurich. Today, 76 years later, we all appeal again for peace and a strong and united Europe. As one of the oldest democracies in the world and as a country of peace, and being very fortunate for not having had a conflict with other countries for over 200 years, we tend to see peace and democracy as natural. As such, the current events are also for us in Switzerland a wake-up call that freedom, democracy, and welfare are not God-given, and we will always have to fight for them. In that sense, the values defended by the European Union are in the DNA of Switzerland and its people. It was therefore not surprising that the Swiss government decided to take over the European Union sanctions, thereby also demonstrating that neutrality does not mean closing your eyes. Dear Mr. President, Latvia and Switzerland have strong and long-standing ties. Several conferences that contributed to the first independence of Latvia in 1918 were held here in Switzerland. We were one of the first countries to recognize the Republic of Latvia, and Switzerland never recognized the Soviet Union's annexation of Latvia in 1941. When we think about the Swiss-Latvian relationship, we also think of the famous Latvian couple, Rainis and Aspasia, both poets and public figures who had to flee your country in 1905 after the failed revolution and who lived for 14 years near Lugano until they were able to return to an independent Latvia in 1920. As both poets and politicians, they both produced important texts about freedom and ethics during their exile here in Switzerland, and many of their views still apply in our modern world. So thank you again, dear Mr. President, and we have a kind of tradition here at the Churchill Lectures to offer to our distinguished guest speakers a symbolic Swiss gift. As we heard, you have lived here for several years as ambassador of Latvia, and you know Switzerland quite well. So I felt our gift needed to have a very special meaning to you. You have a professional background as a lawyer and a keen interest, as we heard, in constitutional law. So I'd like to give you something Swiss and at the same time historic. What not everyone present here tonight may know is that the current Latvian constitution of 1991 was inspired, as we heard, by the Swiss Federation and also the Weimar Constitution. It took us a bit of searching, but we have been able to find you an original copy of the Swiss Federal Constitution from 1848, dating from this very same year, which would I like to offer you as a token of appreciation and our big thank to you. Dear guests, we are at the end of another excellent Churchill lecture, and I thank you very much for having accepted our invitation and for being present here tonight, and I hope to welcome you soon again here at another Churchill lecture. Thank you very much for coming and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks.
Hört man mich jetzt? Hört man mich jetzt?